There is a story of Doris Duke that begins with more money than a child could ever understand and ends with her ashes carried in a Louis Vuitton case by a butler who would not outlive her by very long. She was called the richest girl in the world. She owned houses that looked less like homes than private nations. She filled rooms with art, gardens, music, and the polished treasures of half the earth. And yet, for all that splendor, she spent much of her life wondering who had come for Doris and who had come for the fortune. That was the old contradiction of her life. The crown was placed upon her when she was 12 years old before she had any power to refuse it. The scepter glittered, yes, but in its shadow stood lawyers, husbands, servants, claimants, strangers, and ghosts. Everyone knew the name: the heiress, the scandal, the strange adoption, the death at Rough Point, the will that caused one last war after she was gone. But beneath all of it lay something quieter and sadder. This is the story of a woman who inherited everything except trust. And once trust was gone, even palaces became rooms with locked doors. November 22nd, 1912. New York City was already a city of hard pavements and high windows, of horses giving way to motor cars, of fortunes being counted behind heavy doors. Into that world came Doris Duke, the only child of James Buchanan Duke and Nanaline Holt Duke. Her father was known as Buck. He had not been born among marble staircases. His family's fortune had risen from tobacco fields in North Carolina, from machines that made cigarettes faster than any human hand could roll them, from business instincts sharp enough to make rivals tremble. American tobacco made him vastly rich. Electric power made him richer still. He helped build an empire of smoke, machinery, rivers, mills, and money. And he did what such men often did when they saw the end coming nearer than the beginning. He arranged for his name to survive him. There was Duke University. There was the Duke Endowment. There were houses, investments, and great tracts of land. There was Duke Farms in New Jersey, with thousands of acres, gardens, greenhouses, lakes, and private quiet. There was Rough Point in Newport, looking out toward the Atlantic with the old confidence of American wealth. There was the New York mansion, and in the middle of all this stood a small girl who had not asked to become an heir. Doris's childhood was not ordinary, though there were ordinary things inside it. A child still notices flowers before she notices bank papers. She still listens for footsteps in corridors. At Duke Farms, among gardens and water and carefully made landscapes, something in her settled toward beauty. Plants, rooms, textiles, color, light. These would matter to her all her life. The world outside watched the fortune. Doris watched the surfaces of things and learned slowly that beauty could be arranged when people could not. Her father loved her, and he trained her in his own severe way. He took her into adult rooms. He brought her near business. He showed her the ugly correspondence that wealth attracted, threats, demands, letters from strangers who wanted something. He gave her a lesson that would become both shield and prison. Trust no one. Children should not have to learn that before they have learned the rest of life. But Doris learned it early. When Buck Duke died in 1925, she was 12 years old, not yet 13. The fortune passed toward her in trusts and stages, but the title arrived at once. Newspapers found the phrase and would not let it go. The richest girl in the world. It had the ring of a nursery tale, but there was nothing tender in it. It did not protect her. It marked her. Her mother, Nanaline, was socially ambitious and determined to shape Doris into a proper young woman of her class. She controlled clothes, society, movement, presentation. Yet the money did not truly belong to Nanaline. That mattered. In families, money often speaks in tones no one wishes to admit. By 14, Doris had already found herself in legal conflict connected to the family properties, effectively opposing her mother and executors over real estate her father had loved. It was a hard beginning, a girl too rich to be left alone, too young to govern herself, too watched to be free. She was educated in the manner expected of her station: languages, music, art, culture. She learned French, she studied voice, she developed taste before she had developed peace. The throne had been inherited before the child had grown tall enough to sit comfortably upon it. And then the world began to stare. By the time Doris came of age, America had changed around her. The crash of 1929 had broken ordinary families, emptied accounts, darkened kitchens, and turned once proud men into figures standing in queues. Against that national hunger, Doris's debutante world appeared almost indecent. She and Barbara Hutton, another young heiress born only days apart from her, were paired in the newspapers as the Gold Dust Twins, a phrase that glittered with mockery as much as fascination. Doris was tall, striking, difficult to overlook. Around 6 feet in height, she did not vanish in a ballroom. She was watched at parties and charity events, watched when she traveled, watched when she smiled, watched when she failed to smile. Wealth had made privacy almost impossible. In 1934, at 21, she received a major portion of her inheritance. That same period brought one of her earliest organized acts of giving: independent aid, a charitable vehicle through which she could make donations, often quietly. This was important. Doris was not merely a figure of consumption. She would become a patron, a collector, a preservationist, a giver to medicine, the arts, historic buildings, conservation, and social welfare. Money had been handed to her. She tried, in certain rooms at least, to make it do some good. Then came James H.R. Cromwell. He was older by 16 years, divorced, socially placed, and politically ambitious. Doris was 22 when she married him in 1935. The press treated the marriage as a grand event. The richest girl in the world joined to a man who knew society and wanted public life. To many outside observers, it must have seemed a brilliant match. Yet brilliance is often only light on the surface of water. Their honeymoon opened the world. They traveled through North Africa, the Middle East, India, and Asia. Doris saw architecture, tilework, courtyards, carved wood, pattern, shadow, fountains, and rooms built not merely to impress but to hold stillness. Something in Islamic art and design took hold of her imagination. In Hawaii, she loved the landscape near Diamond Head and began creating Shangri-La, the oceanfront house that would become one of her greatest personal works. There, for a time, one can almost see the young woman she might have been without the watching world. She collected not as a bored heiress, but as someone with appetite and attention. Tiles, ceramics, textiles, architectural fragments, carved panels, she gathered beauty into a house that was also a private museum. She had taken up the scepter of her wealth, and for once it seemed not merely inherited, but chosen. She kept other houses too: Duke Farms in New Jersey, Rough Point in Newport, residences in Manhattan, Falcon Lair in Beverly Hills. These were not only displays, they became laboratories of taste, preservation, and control. If life with people was uncertain, a room could be arranged, a garden could be planned, a collection could be guarded. Her interests widened. She studied jazz piano and composition. She moved near the jazz world of New York. She studied modern dance with Martha Graham. She supported artists and institutions. She funded medical research. She preserved buildings. She loved horticulture. The public image was simple: rich woman, unusual woman, mysterious woman. The real life was more crowded, more capable, and more restless. And yet, inside the marriage, unease had already entered. Cromwell's ambitions depended in part on Doris's money. Politics took him forward and then brought him low. The private bargain between husband and wife had begun to look less like devotion than negotiation. She was young, she was rich, she had built a house by the sea, and grief was already traveling toward her. The first great wound came not as scandal, but as a child. By 1940, Doris and Cromwell were under strain. He had served briefly as United States ambassador to Canada and then resigned to run for the United States Senate from New Jersey. The campaign failed. The marriage, already worn by ambition, resentment, and rumor, had little tenderness left with which to absorb defeat. Then Doris became pregnant. July 1940, Honolulu. Heat, salt air, the sea beyond the windows. Doris gave birth prematurely to a daughter, Arden. The baby lived for only 24 hours. She was born on July 11th and died on July 12th. There are losses that reorder a life without making much noise. A baby's room does not have to be large to become unbearable. A day can be long enough to leave a mother permanently altered. Doris had no surviving biological children. It was said that doctors told her she was unlikely to conceive again. Whether spoken gently or plainly, the meaning was merciless. She lost a child. She lost a marriage. She lost the imagined life that might have softened the rest. We have all known someone who carried a private absence into every room thereafter. The world still saw Doris Duke as fortunate beyond measure. It saw houses, jewels, travel, photographs, famous men. It did not always see the empty space where a daughter had been. Her divorce from Cromwell was finalized in 1943. He received a settlement. Doris was barely into her 30s, but already her father's warning had deepened. Love and money had met at the altar, and money had not remained politely in the background. During the war years, Doris did not simply retreat. She gave money and time. She worked overseas, including as a war correspondent in Europe, and she had connections to wartime service and reporting that complicated the easy picture of an idle heiress. She also moved through circles where glamour and danger often wore the same dinner jacket. In the mid-1940s, she met Porfirio Rubirosa, a Dominican diplomat, sportsman, and celebrated playboy. He was handsome, practiced, and famous for making wealthy women feel chosen. He was connected to Rafael Trujillo's Dominican regime, including through a previous marriage to Trujillo's daughter. He moved through diplomatic society with the ease of a man who understood doors, uniforms, introductions, and desire. There was one immediate obstacle. He was married to French actress Danielle Darrieux. It was whispered that Doris helped clear that obstacle with money. However the matter was arranged, Rubirosa became free, and on September 1, 1947, Doris married him at the Dominican Embassy in Paris. She wore a green Dior suit and a matching velvet hat. Her lawyers produced a prenuptial agreement before the ceremony, a small document standing guard at the edge of romance. And yet, even guarded romance can be ruinous. Doris wanted fidelity. Rubirosa wanted freedom. She gave him expensive gifts, cars, horses, aircraft, property, luxuries that seemed extravagant even in her extravagant world. He continued to move, as he had always moved, toward admiration, pleasure, and other women. The marriage lasted less than 13 months. Afterward came property, alimony, bitterness, and humiliation. Rubirosa would later marry Barbara Hutton, the old comparison, the other heiress, the woman forever paired with Doris in public imagination. Some stories said Doris reacted with fury when she learned it. One hardly needed the detail to understand the wound. The fall did not happen in a single hour. It gathered itself in bedrooms, settlements, headlines, and departures, and then came the gate. October 7th, 1966, Newport, Rhode Island. Rough Point stood above the Atlantic with its heavy rooms, old furniture, and sea air pressing against the windows. Autumn had begun its thinning work. The summer world was leaving. Houses like that knew how to hold footsteps after people had gone. Eduardo Tirella had become one of the trusted figures in Doris Duke's life. He had been a decorated veteran of the Second World War, then a man of fashion, design, and taste. He worked as her decorator, curator, advisor, and close companion in the aesthetic ordering of her houses. He helped shape rooms in New Jersey, Newport, Honolulu, and Beverly Hills. He knew her possessions, her habits, her preferences. He knew the private machinery of her life. By 1966, Tirella wanted to leave her employment and move more fully into his own future in Los Angeles. Leaving Doris was not a simple thing. Those around her understood that attachment, money, employment, and control had become tangled in ways no one could easily loosen. He came to Newport. There were plans to collect belongings and accompany Doris on a brief errand. That afternoon, after reported tension between them, they entered a rented Dodge Polara station wagon. Tirella drove toward the gates of Rough Point, stopped, and got out to open them. Doris moved into the driver's seat. She later said she had meant to pull the car forward and had pressed the accelerator by mistake. The car struck Tirella. He was dragged and crushed. He died before help could save him. The official conclusion was accident. Doris was not criminally charged. Later civil proceedings found her negligent, and Tirella's family received damages small beside the scale of her wealth. Speculation did not end. Some questioned the investigation. Some questioned whether influence had softened what might have happened to someone less protected. A young witness, later spoken of in renewed scrutiny, added further unease to a story already heavy with it, yet no criminal conviction ever followed. Doris herself was found distressed and injured. She had visible head wounds. She was taken to hospital. There were delays before authorities interviewed her. The newspapers fed on the silence. Rumors multiplied, as rumors do around the rich, because wealth creates both distance and suspicion. And that was the moment the scepter slipped. Not because the world finally knew Doris Duke was unhappy. It had known enough of that already. Not because tragedy had entered her life for the first time. Arden had died decades before. The marriages had failed. Trust had curdled. But the death at Rough Point was different. It joined Doris's name forever to a question that could not be fully quieted. From that day onward, the story of Doris Duke carried a colder note. The houses still stood. The money still moved. The art remained. But something had passed through the gates and would not pass back out. Every year after would be heard through that sound. An engine, a crash, a silence. After Tirella's death, Doris did not disappear. She built, restored, funded, collected, traveled, and rearranged the world around her as she had always done. In 1968, she founded the Newport Restoration Foundation, which preserved and restored more than 100 18th and early 19th century buildings on Aquidneck Island. Newport still carries that work. Streets, houses, facades, and rooms survived because Doris Duke paid attention to them. That was one of the strange truths of her life. She could preserve buildings with great care while her human relationships cracked under pressure. She could rescue architecture and fail to rescue trust. She could endow medical research, support the arts, collect Islamic masterpieces, sustain gardens, and still remain, in the most private sense, difficult to reach. At Duke Farms, she developed elaborate indoor display gardens. At Shangri-La, the collection deepened. At Rough Point, she returned seasonally after years of closure and refurnishing. She had rare objects, paintings, decorative arts, textiles, wine, jewels, plants, animals, and a private plane. In one of those details that sounds invented and was not, Rough Point even acquired 2 Bactrian camels, Baby and Princess, connected to a Boeing 737 purchase arrangement. In Doris Duke's life, even eccentricity arrived with paperwork. There were men too, though no third marriage. She was linked over the years with famous and charismatic figures: Duke Kahanamoku, Errol Flynn, jazz musician Joe Castro. Her relationship with Castro became volatile. Allegations of violence entered that chapter as well. Doris moved between glamour and grievance, patronage and conflict, generosity and suspicion. It is the part of these stories we want least to hear, fellow travelers. The part that says a person may have everything visible and still lose the invisible things one by one. Her rivalry with Barbara Hutton had never entirely vanished from the public imagination. Hutton, delicate where Doris was imposing, lavish where Doris could be practical, became the mirror in which journalists loved to compare another lonely heiress. Their lives crossed through Rubirosa, through headlines, through the cruel sport of public fascination. If Doris feared being used for money, Hutton seemed to prove that fear by another route: spending, giving, losing, and being consumed by the same appetite of the world. Doris's own giving was enormous, but not simple. She could be cautious with some, astonishingly open with others. In 1988, she pledged $5 million in municipal bonds to secure bail for Imelda Marcos, the former First Lady of the Philippines, who had been indicted in New York. Imelda wished to return to Hawaii, where Ferdinand Marcos was ill. Doris and Imelda had become friends there. The money was not returned, and Doris later demanded repayment. It became one of the stranger debts circling her estate. That same year brought a far more intimate decision. In the 1980s, Doris met Chandi Heffner, a woman associated earlier with the Hare Krishna movement. Their relationship gathered itself around Doris's grief for Arden, the daughter who had lived only one day. Doris came to believe, or to half believe, that Chandi might be Arden returned to her. Chandi was of an age that made the emotional coincidence possible. The idea was strange, but grief often speaks in symbols before it speaks in reason. On November 5, 1988, 75-year-old Doris Duke formally adopted 35-year-old Chandi Heffner in New Jersey. Chandi became legally her daughter. She entered the household, traveled with Doris, managed aspects of her world, and stood near the center of an inheritance almost too large to imagine. Then suspicion returned. Staff raised concerns. Doris feared she was being poisoned or drugged. Allegations about blood-thinning substances were never conclusively proven. By 1991, she ordered Chandi and Chandi's boyfriend out of Shangri-La. In her final will, Doris expressed regret over the adoption and concluded that Chandi's motive had been financial. The daughter restored became the claimant removed. There was another figure moving closer now. Bernard Lafferty, an Irish butler from County Donegal, introduced into Doris's world in the late 1980s. He was attentive, charming, and deferential. He also had troubles of his own, including alcoholism and a history that would later be examined harshly. As Doris aged, Lafferty's role expanded. He traveled with her. He controlled access. He managed staff. He became the daily gatekeeper. The Hollow Crown had not left Doris unguarded. It had left her guarded by people whose motives would be questioned almost as soon as she was gone. The last 18 months of Doris Duke's life were not grand. They were medical, managed, and increasingly closed. In April 1992, at 79, she underwent cosmetic surgery in Beverly Hills. 2 days later, she fell from bed and broke her hip. That injury began a chain of hospitalizations and operations from which she never truly recovered. In January 1993, she underwent bilateral knee replacement surgery because she wanted to dance again. There is something terribly human in that detail. An old woman, once so tall and commanding, still wanting the body to obey music. She went to Shangri-La to recover, but those around her later described confusion and disorientation. She was taking many medications, sedatives, painkillers, psychiatric drugs, and other prescriptions that could impair the mind. A neurologist found signs of delirium. In that condition, she signed documents granting Bernard Lafferty financial authority, and in April 1993, she signed her final will, naming him executor. The arrangement astonished many. Bernard Lafferty, her butler and relatively recent confidant, was placed in a position of extraordinary power over a vast estate. He was to receive fees and benefits. He also stood close to her medical and domestic world at the very moment she was least able to stand alone. In July 1993, Doris underwent another knee surgery and then suffered a severe stroke. She spent nearly 2 months in intensive care on breathing and feeding tubes. When she returned to Falcon Lair in Beverly Hills, her bedroom had been turned into a hospital room. She weighed around 92 pounds. She was frail, isolated, and surrounded not by a settled family, but by employees, doctors, lawyers, and the man now central to her final arrangements. On October 7, 1993, the 27th anniversary of Eduardo Tirella's death, Doris reportedly told her doctor she did not want to continue living if her health could not improve. A no-code order was placed, meaning she would not be resuscitated if she stopped breathing. In the following weeks, feedings and oxygen were stopped. A morphine drip was ordered for comfort and increased over time. Those final decisions would later become the subject of suspicion and legal dispute. Doris Duke died on October 28, 1993, at Falcon Lair. She was 80 years old. Her death certificate listed cardiac arrest resulting from progressive pulmonary edema. Her body was cremated less than 24 hours later. Lafferty sent a cook to buy a Louis Vuitton makeup case for the ashes. He then flew the case to Duke Farms aboard Doris's private Boeing 737, placing it in the seat where she had always sat. The final scepter was not broken in a ballroom. It sat beside a servant on an aeroplane, reduced to ash and memory. After Doris died, the battle began. Her estate was valued around $1.2 billion, most of it meant for charity. The will placed great authority in Bernard Lafferty's hands and excluded Chandi Heffner. Challenges came, allegations came, old versions of documents were examined, former intimates, legal figures, staff, and claimants circled the fortune she had spent a lifetime trying to protect. Lafferty's own conduct soon damaged him. He spent heavily, bought expensive things, and lived in ways that drew scrutiny. In 1995, a court removed him as executor, citing problems that included alcoholism, substance abuse, waste of estate assets, and a careless attitude toward money. He died in 1996, only 3 years after Doris. Chandi Heffner pursued a claim and settled for $65 million. The foundation created from Doris's fortune went on to support arts, nature, health, child well-being, and other causes. Shangri-La became a museum of Islamic art and culture. Duke Farms became a center for conservation and environmental stewardship. Rough Point remained as a museum, a house still filled with the evidence of Doris's taste. We watch these lives and something stirs in us, pity perhaps, or caution, or that old uneasy knowledge that all the gold, when touched by shadow, still cannot warm a room. Doris Duke was not only scandal, she was not only wealth, She was not only the woman at the wheel outside Rough Point, nor the old heiress in a hospital bed, nor the child in the papers with a fortune too large for childhood. She was all of them at once: collector, giver, daughter, mother for one day, wife twice over, patron, accused woman, lonely woman, woman who saved houses and could not save herself from suspicion. The world remembered the extremes because extremes were easy to print: the richest girl, the dead baby, the playboy husband, the adopted daughter, the butler, the ashes. Yet the quieter image may be the truest. Doris moving through one of her rooms, past objects chosen with care, past beauty gathered from far countries, past windows looking out on land she owned but could never entirely inhabit. The palace remained. The throne was empty. And somewhere in the stillness the fallen scepter lay where no one could spend it, steal it, or hold it anymore. If you found yourself in this story, even for a moment, you may find yourself in the next one too. Subscribe to The Fallen Scepter and stay with us. There are many more lives to remember.